Hi, I'm Dr. Kingston. Let's learn about some spinal nerves. In this video, we are going to be taking on the big picture of a spinal nerve and talking about what the various functions of the different parts of that include. All right, the trick to understanding the big picture of a spinal nerve is to realize that that big picture is of a tree. We have roots that feed into a trunk, and then rami, or branches, that come off from that trunk. Now, our roots are sourced from the spinal gray matter, which sits in that nice H configuration. It has two dorsal horns, which house sensory nuclei, and it has two ventral horns down here that house motor nuclei. All right, we're going to use blue for sensory and red for motor throughout here. All right, we are going to start in the ventral root, or the motor root, because that one is a little bit more straightforward. All right, so we have a motor root with its cell body, or soma, sitting here in the ventral horn of the spinal gray matter. Its axon travels out through the spinal white matter and then into the ventral the ventral root of the spinal nerve. It travels through there and up into the trunk. So that's pretty simple, right? The dorsal or sensory root is also pretty simple. It's just different. The sensory neuron that picks up information from the outside, the periphery, and carries it into the spinal cord does not have a cell body sitting in that sensory nucleus, all right? That nucleus is just where it delivers the morning paper to. Its cell body is actually sitting in a little cluster of other sensory cell bodies just outside the central nervous system called the dorsal root ganglion. And it's called this just because it's attached to the dorsal root. We're not getting very creative here. So to appreciate how this works, you need to know a little secret about sensory neurons. And that is that they are what is called pseudo-unipolar, which is a fancy way of saying that their axon splits into two pieces. One of these pieces goes out to the periphery, and it's picking up sensory information, carrying it back to the dorsal root through the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so it's going to pass that charge from one bit of axon to the next here, and that is going to carry the rest of the way up into the spinal cord here, where it'll synapse with another neuron here in the sensory nuclei. All right, so that is also pretty simple. The takeaway here is that the roots of the spinal nerves carry only one type of neuron. Dorsal root carries only sensory, ventral root carries only motor. Once these roots converge to form the trunk of the spinal nerve, these different fibers all begin to travel together. Okay, so we have a mixture of motor and sensory axons. Now, the trunk of the spinal nerve is actually quite short. It's only about the width of your pinky. So very quickly after it forms, it splits into two primary rami. We have a dorsal primary ramus here, and a ventral primary ramus down here. Now, you probably notice a pretty drastic difference in size here. These rami are responsible for innervating different regions of the body. So the dorsal rami head dorsally to innervate the intrinsic back muscles that attach to the vertebral column and the skin sitting superficial to those. All right, and the ventral rami innervate everything else. So that's all of the anterior and lateral trunk and all of the limbs. So that's why I have drawn the ventral ramus here to be so much bigger than the dorsal ramus, because it is much bigger because it innervates more things. Now, here is a tricky bit. The motor and sensory fibers that were separate here in the roots of the spinal nerves mixed together in the trunk, and they will continue to be mixed as they travel through the rami, or the branches of that trunk. Okay, this is going to be true whether they're traveling along this ventral ramus or along the dorsal ramus. Okay, so they will pick one or the other, but each of those, ventral ramus and dorsal ramus, is going to carry mixed modalities. All right, the last type of innervation that travels along spinal nerves is sympathetic motor. You guys have an entire learning objective devoted to the intricacies of the sympathetic nervous system. So for here, I'm just going to limit discussion to how they're traveling along a spinal nerve. So sympathetic motor is autonomic, which, like parasympathetic, means it uses a 2-neuron pathway in the periphery. That means that we have 2 neurons involved here instead of 1. That's really the only difference. One has its cell body here in the spinal gray matter, and the other is hanging out over here in a ganglion. All right, this looks more complicated than it really is. All right, the important takeaway for you here is that sympathetic innervation is motor innervation, which means that to exit the spinal cord, it has to travel along this ventral root here. That first neuron passes through the spinal nerve trunk and into the ventral ramus to get to its ganglion here. But after that, it acts just like any other motor neuron. It can travel out through the ventral ramus, or it can turn and head out through the dorsal ramus to get to its targets. So if we put these all together, we get a full view of the types of fibers that come together to form a spinal nerve. We see that they are kind of segregated by type in the roots. They join together in the trunk, and they stay mixed in each of the rami. All right, so here is your review question for this session. What types of fibers or axons would you find in the dorsal root of a spinal nerve? Now remember, the roots are separate, so there's only one type of axon traveling in each. Dorsal root you should always associate with sensory, and we find somatic sensory neurons traveling through that root. All right, and that is going to bring us to the end. Thank you for joining me.